Dominus vobiscum.
Et conspiratum tuo.
Are you the only one that knew that?
No, I knew that.
Okay.
I was hoping you knew the next
I was
part.
just
I don't know.
laughing.
Welcome to Restless. This is Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, and you have joined Diane, Joe, and Lauren as today we restlessly seek the face of God in the beauty of the liturgy. And today's topic is one that is going to be potentially controversial. Probably shouldn't be, but it's a beautiful way in which we worship, and that is the traditional Latin Mass. So, first of all, I just want to hear from you about your own experience of the traditional Latin Mass. Have you been to one? And if so, what has been your experience of it?
So, yes, I've been to probably like 10 or so traditional Latin Masses. And honestly, the first time that I went, I'm not going to lie, it was super confusing. I didn't even know that they started. Like, we were at the gospel. Like, I mean, it is so confusing. If you walk in there, you're not with anyone. You don't have a missal. You have it's all Latin chant, everything. I felt like a fish out of water. But it is, once you like get past that, it's so beautiful because you have all this time for silence and prayer that's built in. I would say, I go to the solemn mass at St. John's in Stamford, which is a Novus Ordo, but it's solemn. So it's kind of like, to me, the best of both worlds because you get the Latin and you get a like longer prayer time and beautiful sacred music. But, it's not predominantly in Latin.
Yeah, it's not the traditional Latin Mass. That's true.
I've been to one traditional Latin Mass in my life. When I was at Marist, a friend of mine invited me to a low Mass at St. Patrick's, which was Highland maybe or something like that in New York. It did not fit the stereotype of TLM Masses among conservative Catholics, by which I mean it was not a thriving community of young couples with 100 kids. It was maybe a dozen and a half people above the age of 70, and then us. Who,
well, it was a low Mass though. So.
It was low Mass, yeah. It was low Mass.
So probably no music, right?
No music. We had a little missal. I mean, it was interesting. It was interesting. It was beautiful still, obviously. I haven't been back. Not because I don't want to, but because I wouldn't even know where to in Bethel. There's not exactly a ton of
a hub of.
No, well, there used to be
in Danbury.
There used to be, but Father Clark's no longer at St. Patrick's or Peter's, wherever he were.
He's at St. Joseph's.
Yeah,
but now he's at Sacred Heart in Georgetown, which is not far from Bethel.
That is true.
Latin Mass every Sunday.
That's where he was. All right, so maybe I'll pursue it.
Yeah, that church in Georgetown is about the size of like my bedroom. It seats like 25 people max, but it's beautiful. Have you ever been to one, Lauren?
I don't think so, no.
Oh, you would remember if you were.
I'm going with no.
Okay.
Have you ever concelebrated one? I know you haven't celebrated one.
Well, you can't concelebrate.
Can't you? Oh,
there is no concelebration. Yeah, so I have sat in choir for at least one, but I've been to probably maybe 5 or 6 in my life. And I like Diane, it's definitely confusing. Even with the missal, I was still confused.
Yeah,
because you have to know Latin, and especially when they do even the scripture readings in Latin.
Yeah,
you're kind of like, wow, I don't understand what's going on here. So it does force you to be a lot more engaged, perhaps, because you can't just sit there passively and allow yourself to take in what's happening. You have to really wrestle with what's happening. So, of course, recently in the church, that's been somewhat controversial, this traditional Latin Mass. Tell us a little bit about the controversy, Joe. You're our expert.
Someone's going to write in and say he got this very wrong, so I apologize in advance to whoever you are. And you know who you are. My brief overview of it would be that at some point in his papacy, Pope Benedict XVI issued a motu proprio called Summorum Pontificum.
2008.
Okay, thank you.
I do know the date on that.
Okay, which gave, basically to my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, Father, gave all Roman priests, by which I mean Latin priests, non-Eastern churches, the right to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass, as it was then called, as they wanted. I believe they didn't even need permission from the bishops. Is that correct?
Correct, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that was the status quo for a very long time, until this past summer, maybe, Pope Francis issued a new motu proprio called Traditionis Custodes, which completely changed that, and which basically makes it the purview of the bishop to decide what priests can celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. It also standardized by which missal it had to be celebrated. I believe it requires readings to be done in vernacular, not in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
It does a lot of other things. It forces, and there was a subsequent response to a dubia by the Congregation for Divine Worship and Sacraments.
So explain it,
Now
dubia.
the dicastery. Dubia is a question submitted to the Vatican by usually a bishop or something like that, and this has legislative force, to my knowledge. And this clarification kind of went further on some of these reforms. So there are things like a priest ordained after the promulgation of the motu proprio, their name must be submitted to the Vatican for approval. Yeah?
Yes.
I'm right about that.
Yes.
What is now called the Usus Antiquitor Mass, not the TLM Mass or the Traditional Latin Mass. And there were other reforms, and it gave diocesan bishops a lot more power to regulate it. So, like, for example, Cardinal Cupich, who is the Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago, has made it such that I think parishes are required or are prohibited from celebrating the Traditional Latin Mass on the first Sunday of the month or something like that, and he's restricted ad orientem in some ways, I think, and then there's some weird things with the motu proprio about, like, well, you can't have like a designated church as that's TLM, but also you can, and it has to be in a different building, but there are no. It gets a little complicated as what it actually means. It's still being sussed out, I think, by canon lawyers.
Yeah,
but that would be my overview, such as it's accurate.
So, I mean, what do you think of this controversy? I mean, what do you think of the Latin Mass in general? Because it is seeing somewhat of a renaissance, I think, in the church. I mean, when I was growing up, I never even heard of it. Really? I mean, until I went to college, and then I went to one in college, which was a 45-minute drive away from Steubenville. But now it seems to be popping up here and there, and like a lot of the younger priests are celebrating it. And I don't know. What's your reaction to that?
Okay, I would just say that here's how I read it. Right, this is something that Matt Fradd has said, which I think is exactly right. Which is, there's a certain type of especially younger Catholic who gets very traditional very fast in terms of their liturgical preferences. And it's easy to look at that and say, well, that's a little weird. But I think you have to understand in the context that tradition was really ripped out of a lot of churches very quickly after the council.
It really was.
And
yeah.
so then if you walk into this and you don't like Father Trendy strumming his guitar and playing CDs of, various...
I take offense at that.
Do you? I don't consider
as a guitarist.
Okay, yeah, but you're not Father Trendy. If you don't like that, if you don't like sort of like watered down Novus Ordo Mass, then this is maybe your alternative, and you don't have a sort of like... You don't have a memory of tradition to go back on, so you just jump into it all of a sudden, and you get kind of swept into the whole thing. It becomes a very weird cultural thing. I've lost track of what your question was. I'm realizing as I'm talking about it.
That's okay. I enjoy your diversion. I think the question was, what's your take on why is it experiencing renaissance? And
because people want tradition and they don't know where to get it, and so this is the source of it. I think that's my answer.
Yeah, and I mean, there really is predominantly nowadays a lack of reverence in celebrating, the Mass, the Novus Ordo Mass. And I mean, I guess it's definitely like the controversy is heated. I think that stems kind of back to what Joe was talking about in the council of like the question of continuity. Like, is this new Mass completely new, or is it like in accord with how it's always been celebrated? And I think a lot of people have taken, sort of the stance that, and there's the controversy too of like, right, that was Vatican II a pastoral council? Did it actually, have weight? There's a spectrum of people on sort of like the traditional, the lens of the way that they look at it. But I think, when it comes down to it, it's like, there is something when you walk into a traditional Latin Mass or a solemn Mass in Novus Ordo that is like celebrated very reverently that, really makes you aware of the divine, right? And raises your heart to that, as opposed to like going into some bare bones, like Protestant looking church essentially, because after Vatican II, a lot of these churches were stripped of their beauty. And, with guitars and pianos and songs about like, how does Jesus make me feel? It's like, you kind of lose, what are we doing here? And sort of the grandeur of who God is. Like, God is king. And I think that the traditional Mass and like those very reverently celebrated solemn Novus Ordo Masses that have circuit music and a lot of incense and are in beautiful settings do raise your mind and your heart to God and create like a reverence for what we're doing at Mass, which is like the greatest prayer that you could offer.
Yeah, there's a seriousness where people are like, we take our faith seriously.
Yeah.
Because of the effort it takes.
Yeah, but it makes you believe it too, right? So if you're walking into a parish, I've walked into many parishes where I'm like, what the heck is this? There's guitars, there's people talking all over the place. Like, you can tell that they don't understand, either don't understand or don't care that Jesus is present, right? But that, I think, is a product of the environment, that Mass is being set in.
Yeah.
That there's a complete lack of reverence, and we're losing, who is here? I mean, this is Christ the King.
Yeah. And in many ways, it does begin with the priest reverence.
Mm-hmm.
And growing up in Baltimore, we had some wacky Masses. And priests would make up their own Eucharistic prayer and just, the stuff that I had to endure, growing up. Like, it's a wonder that anyone stayed Catholic.
Well, the other thing about the traditional Latin Mass, and a shorthand we'll keep using, even though I guess it's technically been abrogated by the Holy Father, but that's easier than Usus Antiquitor.
Yeah.
The other thing is that there's no mistaking the sacrificial nature of a traditional Latin Mass. I mean, if you have a particularly irreverently celebrated Novus Ordo Mass, you can miss the fact that it's sacrificed, and it becomes just like a sort of communal meal, or like a presentation, or like a comedy hour with Father. And you don't have that with the TLM. It's very obvious what you're doing there. There's an altar, and everything revolves around the altar, and it's very clearly seriously about the sacrificial act of the Mass, which is just different. That's lost in a lot of Novus Ordo contexts.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Yeah. So all these things sound so beautiful, so why is there a controversy in the church? Do you feel like the traditional Latin Mass divides the church?
I don't think I can comment much.
Well, yeah.
You gotta go, Lauren.
I definitely think it does. I mean, there are some hardcore TLM folks, and there are some hardcore liberal folks. And again, there's a spectrum, right? But the hardcore TLM are, don't believe that the Novus Ordo. I mean, you have, I think, SSPX, right? The Society of
St. Pius X.
St. Pius X. Those people, I believe, don't believe that the Novus Ordo is even a valid Mass, right?
It depends. I know some families that are SSPX that do also come to the Novus Ordo and receive communion there, so they admit that it's valid. But
yeah, I mean, but there are some people on that spectrum that
but some don't,
don't, are basically don't think that Vatican II was valid, don't accept it. And there are people on the other side of the spectrum who are just like, everything goes, interpret Vatican II for what it is. And you've seen that in terms of how priests celebrate Mass, I'm sure that they've received their opinion from what they've experienced, and some of them enjoy that. So there is a heated controversy in terms of traditionalists getting super heated about, to Joe's point. And I mean, I do too, and I'm not a TLM person, but it's there's something to be said about the sacrifice of the Mass, and there should be a reverence for it. And a lot of times there's not at many of these Novus Ordo Masses, so they just they clash.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to overstate, and I think this is the source of a lot of conflict. It's very easy to overstate the percentage of the TLM crowd that's actually denies the validity of the Francis Pontificate or the Second Vatican Council or the Novus Ordo. I've never met one. I mean, have you, Father? I'm sure you probably met one or two people, but
not really.
I travel in some more traditional circle. I mean, have you guys ever met a single person who denied the validity of either of those three who wasn't already a member of SSPX or something like that?
Actually, no, I take that back. No, I
one
do.
Or two, maybe.
I do know a couple.
But
now
you're
comes
right.
to mind.
The majority probably
enough
don't.
And I mean, the thought experiment I always suggest is take the average crowd at Novus Ordo at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning and the average TLM crowd at the same time and poll them. And what's higher, the percentage of the Novus Ordo crowd who doesn't believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist, or the TLM crowd and the percentage of them who believe that insert this thing that's not valid, Novus Ordo, the Second Vatican Council, Francis Pontificate, whatever it is. Very obviously, to me at least, the actual problem is not a schismatic or anti-papal thought stream in the TLM crowd. I'm sure it's there, but I don't think it's dominant.
No.
I see no evidence that it's dominant. And I think that we treat it as if it is sometimes.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. I was going to say something and I totally lost my train of thought.
Your other point, though, is very good about sort of the, I think, what is it, that Pew poll?
70% of Catholics, whatever that means.
Yeah, don't believe in the real presence of the Eucharist. And, to me, that's honestly in thinking about it, no surprise for some of the Novus Ordo masses that I've attended. I mean, there's a lack of reverence. So if the priest is not acting like Jesus is present, how are parishioners going to, who are, and granted, we all have I'm not saying, like, we definitely have a responsibility to, to form ourselves and to grow in knowledge and in love of God. But I mean, for the people who only go to Mass once a week, it's sometimes going to those Masses, it's like I'm sitting in the pew and I'm like, no wonder they don't believe, because they're not well formed, but the priest is not
showing that he believes.
Is not showing that he believes. And so,
right.
Then you have all the problems with sacrilegious communions and things like that. And
well, I think we do sometimes forget that we are body soul composites, and our bodies need to experience the reverence of the Eucharist as much as our minds do. And right now the United States bishops are embarking on this 3-year campaign of Eucharistic reverence, and some of it has, I'm sure, good intentions behind it. They're going to have a big Eucharistic conference, I guess, in Indianapolis, and they're going to have these Eucharistic preachers go out to all the different parishes and things, which is a beautiful idea. It is going to cost $24 million, which is kind of a hefty price tag. And I've thought to myself, what would actually increase Eucharistic reverence? Just to have people receive kneeling on the tongue. And that's free. It doesn't cost any money, because we are body and soul. And you can't deny that something special is happening if you're kneeling in front of it and receiving it on your tongue. You just can't deny that. I mean...
Yeah, Father Lapastino, too, he's the pastor at St. John's in Stanford. He gave a beautiful talk in the rectory on the Eucharist. It was a series, and he said specifically about kneeling. It's, like you're kneeling before a king, but it was also a beautiful image that he gave of Jesus, feeding us himself. And so, like we're being fed by him as opposed to like on your hands when you're kind of, taking it and feeding yourself.
Yeah.
Being fed by God. So I thought that was another beautiful image, and kind of helped me to like reiterate the fact that like that's why I receive communion kneeling.
Now I will take a little bit of quibble though with there's a priest in our diocese who I'm very close friends with, but who only celebrates the traditional Latin Mass, and he commissioned a study a few years ago about kind of what you were talking about, Joe, about like the theological opinions of those who go to the traditional Latin Mass and those who go to Novus Ordo, and he found similar things, that people that go to traditional Latin Mass don't contracept, and that they believe in the real presence. And he was using that study to say, well, look, the traditional Latin Mass causes an increase of faith.
Ridiculous, yeah.
And my response to him was, it's not causation, it's correlation. So it attracts people that are already fervent Catholics. And that was what I challenged him with, was said, the traditional Latin Mass is beautiful, but how can you use that to evangelize somebody that's on the fringes, somebody that's, an average parish goer who does contracept and who doesn't believe?
Right.
I mean, do you just simply walk into St. Stephen's, whatever, and just say, all right, traditional Latin Mass next Sunday,
right,
like it or not? There's got to be a gradual... I don't know what the gradual
well, and you're right.
piece is there.
And sometimes the TLM people, they kind of kind of poo-poo the serious barriers to entry to actually actively participating in a TLM Mass. Like they act like, oh yeah, well, you just embrace the, you say that's nice, but if you don't actually speak Latin, why are you listening to gospel reading in Latin? Like it does, like it's on just a fundamental level. If I said to you, embrace the mystery, I'm going to read it to you in German tomorrow, you'd be like, well, that's ridiculous, I don't speak German. It's like, well, right, right, you don't. So like, I think that's one good thing about Traditionis Custodes is, yeah, you should get the readings in vernacular, because the readings are not, I would say, not first our prayer to God, but God's word to us.
Right.
Right. So there's a difference there. And I think that's maybe one step where it's like, yeah, maybe the whole thing doesn't need to be in Latin. Maybe there should be some vernacular in the readings, at least. And the homily obviously has to be in vernacular, unless the priest is particularly skilled at Latin.
Oh, gosh. When I teach here at Cardinal Kung Academy, and I have a couple of kids that are pretty exclusively Latin Mass in my class, and we were talking about, okay, how do you actively participate in the Mass? Because that's really that was the theme of the Second Vatican Council's Sacrosanctum Concilium, was the idea of full, conscious, and active participation in the Mass. And they said, well, the way we participate in the Mass is we pray the Rosary. Ugh. And I said, no, that's not how you should be participating. They're like, well, but why? We're there, we're praying. I'm like, no, that's not the right time to pray the Rosary. I love the Rosary, but not during Mass.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think one of the beautiful things about sort of the Novus Ordo is the fact that, like, the Eucharistic prayer, especially because we're called to participate and make our own sacrifice, you follow the words and you kind of understand what that we're not just bystanders in the pew, just sitting there. It's not about entertainment, it's about worship. And so what do we bring to God? I think it's very helpful to kind of meditate on the words of the Eucharistic prayers.
Right. We can't forget that that the Novus Ordo came out of a context, and the context was that there were real issues. There were some real issues with the traditional Latin Mass. One of which is, the disconnect of the people who would do their own devotions during Mass. Yeah. Another one, I'll never forget reading St. Alphonsus Liguori, said that if a priest celebrates Mass in less than 15 minutes, he commits a mortal sin. And I read that and I'm like, how in the world is that even possible to celebrate Mass in less than 15 minutes? But apparently, for low Masses, that was common to say a Mass in 10 minutes. And that was that mentality of, it's the sacrifice, it's the objective reality. Forget about the people in the pew. Forget about even my own holiness as the priest. I just have to say the words as fast as I can to make the sacrifice acceptable. And that's why the church said, no, let's take a step back and
that's interesting.
Kind of look at that and said, let's actually, because we think the traditional Latin Mass for centuries was always Palestrina and choral music at every one.
Right.
No, there was a ton of low Masses because you had to do Mass every hour on the hour at most parishes, right?
Yeah,
so.
And that also, to my knowledge, came out of a context in which there were so many priests that you actually didn't have enough parishioners for them to all say Mass for them. So you'd have these side altar situations where priests were actually celebrating low Masses by themselves because there were no parishioners for them. And that's not where we are now. So that
that's certainly true.
Context shouldn't be reigning today, right? Like there's less of a need for low Mass. And the low Mass, the reason you couldn't hear because you didn't need to hear because you weren't listening anyway, because there was an actual high Mass happening in front of you too. So Jesus didn't, the apostles didn't start celebrating Mass at Orientum in Latin, 3 days after Pentecost. Like that wasn't the historical context fixed forever. That changed too.
I mean, the original language, of course, was Greek.
But I think your point about rushing, right? So that's the thing that got me to start going to the solemn Mass at St. John's, which when I first walked in there, I was like, back in the day, I was so intimidated. It was almost like the first time you go into a Latin Mass, you almost feel like these people are like, I have a mark on my face and they know that I'm not one of them, And so when I went to St. John's for the first time too, to the solemn Mass, I was like, these people know that I'm not one of them. But it was beautiful because I find a lot of the Novus Ordo Masses nowadays are rushed. Even if it's 45 minutes, it's like you're just going from one thing to the other to the other. There's no time for prayer or meditation or anything.
There's no silence in the Mass.
And that's sad to me. I mean, I'm fortunate to be able to go to daily Mass every day, and I read the readings in advance, which I encourage everyone to do. But I mean, it's just for people who don't, I just sit there and I'm like, no wonder that they probably don't get anything out of this, because if you're not reading the readings in advance and the Sunday Mass is over in 30 to 45 minutes. I mean, that's really fast.
Whereas that's really fast.
Like at St. John's, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, like, can we,
pick up the pace here?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was a priest at St. John's who would pride himself on the 12-minute daily Mass.
Yeah.
12 minutes. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't even.
Yeah.
I can't get through the readings in 12 minutes.
But there is something to be said about just like the music sort of just forcing you to slow down and be silent.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a big problem in our society today. Like people have such attention problems because of our smartphones and technology that they can't it's bothersome to sit in silence for that long of like, what am I doing?
So can I go back to something you said at the very beginning?
Yeah.
You said something about like walking in and feeling like you had a mark on your face. And I think there's a stereotype of traditional Latin Mass Catholics being very judgmental. Mm-hmm. Have you found that to be the case?
I am not sure, really. I don't really know what people truly think.
But you felt that.
Yeah,
you didn't
definitely
feel like they were necessarily welcomed into.
Yeah, and I also wasn't wearing like a veil or anything, so yeah, I know.
Scandalous. Even the computer
Mortal
gasped.
sin right there. But you can't help but feel like a fish out of water, So, and I honestly, I mean, I'm sure, Joe, to your point, maybe this is just a misconception, but
I'm sure there's truth to it. I'm
sure there are some people.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's other people who don't care,
Yeah.
But I heard of one story of someone who is late 60s, like early 70s, going on and on and on to our friend Father Connaughton about the traditional Latin Mass and how it's the best form of the Mass and the only form that the Mass should be done and such. And Father John's church doesn't do this, of course. And he's like,
Mm-hmm.
like just listening. Then I find out after the fact that this person doesn't even go to Mass anymore. And it's just so funny, right? Yeah. Like they're stuck in the old tradition, and this is the only way, but they aren't even practicing any longer for whatever reasons. I don't know what those may be.
And there's definitely a certain like one-upsmanship, especially like an online trad culture, where it's like,
Oh, boy.
this isn't valid. Well, this isn't valid. Well, this isn't valid. So, I'm only Pope Alexander the First. It's like, all right, well, let's think of a random pope, only Gregory the First, and nothing after that. It's like, all right, well, calm down a minute. It does get, it can get a little silly. I mean, I haven't been to very many of I've only been to one of these masses, and so my typical encounter with these people is like in a social setting, because I'm a very cool person and hang out in all kinds of,
Where all the cool Catholics
go to
hang
great
out.
parties where there are lots of TLM people, and they're always just happy that somebody who goes to Novus Ordo is willing to hear them out and likes beauty in the liturgy. So that's been my experience, but it has to be the case that there's judgment, because and probably based on some things that are actual real criticisms of the Novus Ordo.
Yeah.
Right, but which nonetheless doesn't give you right to judge people.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, without a doubt, there's judgment within Novus Ordo
Hardcore.
people too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just within the human heart, but that can be a stereotype. And what other stereotypes sometimes are out there with the TLM community?
I think just like holier than thou, sort of. That's a big one.
Big families.
Big
right?
families.
That's a great thing. I wish there were more big families.
Yeah.
So is the traditional Latin Mass where the call and response is only priest to altar server? Is that the case?
It depends.
That would be a low mass, right?
Because the only thing that I know about it is my grandpa saying that he used to be an altar server and that he couldn't cut it because he could not learn Latin. That's my only impression.
That's funny.
Yeah.
But I think that's actually maybe a misconception people have. A traditional Latin Mass is not is not a Novus Ordo where where the Agnus Dei is in Latin instead of English. That's not that's a Novus Ordo. And the traditional Mass is actually different in structure. It's longer, it's different prayers, there's different words. Even if you're
Different order. Yeah.
Different order. Yeah. So that's actually different. It's a different thing. And I know we're eventually going to talk about the way they can interplay with each other. And that was the original hope of Pope Benedict XVI with Summorum Pontificum, was that the two rites would inform each other.
Mm-hmm.
And whether that has happened or not is a matter for debate, I suppose. The Holy Father doesn't think so, and that's why he promulgated this Numer Proprio. But
Yeah.
So I have a question that may be dumb. I don't know. But I understand that we have documents from very early on in the church of the structure of the Mass.
We do.
And that the Mass that we celebrate today follows that. But do both the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo Mass follow it in the same structure, or has the structure changed?
There's been different elements. The overall structure is the same, but there's different elements that were actually very present in the early Mass that then faded away. For example, the sign of peace is from the early church, and it was always done until I think probably until Gregory the Great, when he kind of codified the entire Mass. So for 7 centuries that was done, and that was brought back. But that's not a 1970s invention.
and that was the way that was done was by waving your 2 fingers obnoxiously in the air to people across the room, right? They would wave they would gesticulate wildly with their fingers.
Well, they used to call it
Wave
What, you
and,
don't like that,
good
Joe?
good to see you, and squeeze the elbow, and how are the kids? That was how they did it, right?
Definitely. Or
Is
like
that how
a
they
pound
did
of
that?
the
Yeah.
chest.
Well,
That's what the kiss of peace meant, right?
Right, it was
Waving
the kiss of
people-
peace.
right.
And so it wasn't just a sign. You actually leaned in for, a fraternal kiss. I don't know whether you actually made contact, but
It was like one of those
I don't think they do ordination, right? You kind of just.
yeah, you just kind of do the face in.
As an aside, I loved watching. I watched the ordination mass on Facebook, so I got to see really close. And
I did too.
I loved watching all the priests try to figure out which way do they go, and left, right, and poor Father Lomnitzer couldn't keep up with them.
Oh, no.
Right, left, people kept
Yeah,
changing
choose the
on
wrong
him.
side.
One side, both sides, one side. It was very funny.
It's a struggle.
Yeah.
Struggle is very real.
But I think to Lauren's point, Saint Justin, martyr, he in the first apology kind of described what Christian worship looked like back then, and it seemed like based on what I read that the Novus Ordo does follow that, but there have been. I think another misconception, right, is that the TLM was celebrated consistently like that for 2,000 years, but hasn't it always changed? I mean,
Gregory the Great really kind of codified it. So there were different
Yeah.
rites around, and there's still even after Trent there were different rites around, because there was a rite that was called the Ambrosian Rite, which is only celebrated in Milan, the only place in the world you could celebrate it. Or there's one in Toledo, Spain. You can only celebrate in Toledo.
Dominican rite, probably. I mean, I don't know. How
Dominican Rite, which that's not
prior to Trent,
far
I mean, it
off,
was
but-
always developing, right? So
Yeah, not so much really. To be honest, it was actually pretty much written down by Gregory the Great, which was in the seventh century.
But I think we would assume so because of our experience with the Novus Ordo. And I think that gets to a very legitimate criticism from the TLM crowd against the Novus Ordo crowd, which is that you have these centuries of mostly stagnation in the liturgy, and whether you think that's good or bad is a good question. But then you have the Second Vatican Council, which calls for things like the preservation of Gregorian chant, the use of potentially of ad orientem mass, Latin, and you have these priests who are like, well, the spirit of Vatican II told me that there should be guitars everywhere, and there should be no altar rails, and you have to receive on the on the hand, and we have to sing one bread, one body 8 times a week, or it's not valid. And like that wasn't in Sacrosanctum Concilium. Like
no,
so like
gosh.
the actual like Vatican II reforms to the Mass, had we gotten them, would have been great and probably would have resolved a lot of these tensions.
Right.
And I think that we can't overlook the fact there are a lot of priests and bishops who refuse to celebrate the liturgy reverently in according to tradition, and then want to turn around and say, how dare you want tradition in this way? So if you were giving it to us, we wouldn't be there wouldn't be this big draw to the TLM if the order was feeding people.
So the TLM really kind of is a reaction to what we've seen over the last 7 years.
There's no question about that.
Yeah, I would agree.
It's not like it's not like people remember growing up that way at this point. So it has to be a reaction. It's not organic in that way.
That's very true. Well, unfortunately, we ran out of time, but I think we'll continue this conversation in a little bit. So thanks so much for joining us on this episode of Restless, this controversial episode. You can find us on 1350, Veritas Catholic Network, and also wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in next time.